The Lakewood Preparatory Academy auditorium falls into shocked silence as a woman in a modest blazer steps onto the stage, flanked by state officials carrying the seal of the governor's office. Principal Kenneth Ashford's confident expression crumbles as he recognizes the concerned parent he dismissed and patronized during the disciplinary hearing 20 minutes earlier. "Good afternoon, faculty and staff," Governor Angela Morrison announces, her voice carrying unmistakable authority. "I'm Governor Angela Morrison. Some of you may not recognize me without the usual security detail and media presence. I've spent the past week observing this school incognito to investigate allegations of systematic racial discrimination in discipline." Her eyes lock onto Ashford, who has gone pale. "Principal Ashford, I just watched you expel Jamal Richardson, a 4.0 honor student with 0 prior infractions, for defiance and disruptive behavior that consisted of him respectfully questioning why he was being accused of cheating. Meanwhile, you gave a white student who actually plagiarized an essay a warning and academic probation. The gathered staff freezes in stunned recognition. The principal who 30 minutes ago wielded absolute authority over students' futures now faces the governor whose investigation will end his career, and the cameras are rolling. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 7 days earlier, Governor Angela Morrison had sat in her state capitol office reviewing the most disturbing complaint her administration had received in her 3 years as governor. At 46, Morrison had built her political career on educational equity, having grown up in an underfunded rural school district where she'd witnessed firsthand how systemic inequality destroyed potential. Her unlikely rise from that struggling district to Yale Law School and eventually the governor's mansion had given her both credibility and determination to ensure every child received quality education. Regardless of their background, the complaint had come from Dr. Tamara Jackson, a prominent physician and community organizer in Millbrook, whose nephew had been one of 7 black students expelled from Lakewood Preparatory Academy in the past academic year. Jackson's documentation was meticulous. She'd compiled disciplinary records showing that black students at Lakewood received suspensions and expulsions at rates 14 times higher than white students. Despite representing only 12% of the student body, what made the disparity even more troubling was that Lakewood Preparatory Academy was a public charter school, receiving state funding while operating with significant autonomy from traditional district oversight. The school had been founded 15 years earlier with a mission of academic excellence and college preparation, and had indeed achieved impressive results: 98% graduation rate, average SAT scores in the top 10% nationally, and admission rates to prestigious universities that rivaled elite private schools. But Jackson's research revealed that those exceptional outcomes were built partially on systematically removing black students through discriminatory discipline that used subjective infractions like defiance, disrespect, and disruptive behavior to justify expulsions for minor infractions that white students committed without consequence. Principal Kenneth Ashford had led Lakewood Prep for 20 years, hired as founding principal when the school opened. His reputation was sterling. Administrator of the Year Awards, featured in national education publications, and credited with creating a culture of academic excellence that had transformed the school into Millbrook's most sought-after educational institution. Parents competed for limited enrollment slots, and graduation from Lakewood Prep was widely considered a guarantee of college acceptance. What the accolades and statistics didn't capture was that Ashford's culture of excellence was maintained through selective enrollment practices that screened out students he deemed unlikely to succeed, and aggressive discipline that removed those who somehow got through the screening process but didn't fit his narrow definition of appropriate student behavior, a definition that correlated suspiciously with race rather than actual misconduct. Morrison's Education policy team had spent 2 months investigating Jackson's allegations quietly, analyzing discipline data across all of Millbrook's schools to determine whether Lakewood's disparities were anomalous or representative of broader district problems. The results were clear. No other school in the district showed anything approaching Lakewood's racial disparities in discipline. While implicit bias existed throughout the education system, Lakewood's patterns suggested intentional rather than unconscious discrimination. But data alone wouldn't be sufficient to force accountability for a principal as politically connected as Ashford. The Lakewood Prep Board of Directors included influential community leaders who viewed the school as a jewel of Millbrook's educational landscape. Any attempt to challenge Ashford's leadership, based solely on statistical analysis, would face fierce resistance from parents, who credited him with their children's success, and board members invested in protecting the school's reputation. Morrison needed undeniable evidence of discriminatory intent, not just disparate impact. She needed to witness Ashford's bias in action, to document the subjective judgments and double standards that statistics revealed but couldn't prove conclusively. Her solution was unprecedented for a sitting governor: going undercover to observe Lakewood Prep's disciplinary process firsthand. She would pose as a concerned community member, volunteering as a parent observer for the school's discipline committee, a role that would give her access to hearings while attracting minimal scrutiny. The plan carried enormous political risk. If her identity was discovered prematurely, it could appear like gubernatorial overreach or political theater rather than legitimate oversight. If she found no evidence of discrimination during her observation period, it would validate Ashford's defenders and undermine Jackson's complaint. And there was always the possibility that Ashford would modify his behavior if he suspected heightened scrutiny, making Morrison's undercover observation capture an unrepresentative sample. But Morrison believed the risk was justified. Every day Ashford remained unchallenged was another day black students faced discriminatory removal from educational opportunities that could transform their futures. The achievement gap that Morrison had dedicated her career to closing was being widened by administrators like Ashford, who used discipline as a tool for maintaining racial homogeneity rather than addressing actual misconduct. Morrison had prepared carefully for her undercover role. She'd grown her hair out slightly, adopted glasses she didn't normally wear, and dressed in modest business casual that contrasted with her usual polished professional attire. She'd studied the mannerisms of parent volunteers, practiced softening her naturally authoritative bearing, and memorized background details for her cover identity as Angela Morrison, a recently retired nonprofit administrator interested in educational equity. Her security detail had objected strenuously to the plan, citing both safety concerns and the unprecedented nature of a governor conducting personal undercover investigations. But Morrison had overruled them, bringing only Lieutenant Governor Thomas Reeves and State Education Commissioner Dr. Patricia Nguyen into her confidence, along with a small technical team that would monitor her safety remotely. The target was a disciplinary hearing scheduled for Jamal Richardson, a 16-year-old honor student who had been accused of cheating on a chemistry exam based on allegations Morrison's team had already determined were questionable at best. Richardson's case fit the pattern Jackson had documented: a high-achieving black student facing severe consequences for allegations that would merit, at most, a conference and warning for white students. As Morrison had driven to Lakewood Prep that morning, she reflected on what this investigation meant for her governorship. Using executive authority to personally investigate discrimination at a single school might seem like misplaced priorities when her state faced budget challenges, healthcare access issues, and infrastructure needs. But Morrison had always believed that education was the foundation for addressing every other social problem, and that allowing discrimination to flourish in schools normalized injustice that would perpetuate across generations. What she didn't know as she entered Lakewood Prep's administration building was that within hours, she would witness discrimination even more blatant than Jackson's documentation had suggested. That Ashford's arrogance would lead him to demonstrate his bias with shocking clarity, and that the hearing room, where he expected to exercise unchallenged authority, would become the stage for the most dramatic accountability moment in Millbrook's educational history. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Angela Morrison arrived at Lakewood Preparatory Academy at 8:15 a.m., 45 minutes before Jamal Richardson's disciplinary hearing was scheduled to begin. The campus was beautiful. Modern architecture, well-maintained grounds, and facilities that rivaled elite private schools. Everything about the physical environment communicated excellence and opportunity. The contrast between the school's impressive appearance and its discriminatory practices made the injustice even more offensive. Morrison checked in at the main office, introducing herself as Angela Martin, the parent volunteer observer who'd been approved to sit in on discipline committee meetings as part of a community engagement initiative. The receptionist barely looked up from her computer, directing Morrison to the conference room where hearings were conducted. Vice Principal Stuart Bennett greeted her with practiced courtesy that didn't quite mask his indifference to parent observers. "Ms. Martin, welcome. You'll be observing from the back of the room. Please don't interrupt proceedings or interact with students or families. We appreciate community interest in our processes, but hearings need to proceed without external interference." His framing of parent observation as potential interference rather than legitimate oversight was telling. The administration viewed accountability mechanisms as nuisances rather than necessary checks on their authority. Morrison took her seat in the back corner, where she had clear sightlines to observe while appearing peripheral to the proceedings. She activated the concealed recording device her technical team had provided, legally authorized under her gubernatorial authority to investigate civil rights violations in state-funded institutions. Jamal Richardson entered the conference room at 9 a.m. with his mother, Diane Richardson, and their hastily retained attorney, Michael Foster. Jamal was clearly nervous but composed, wearing a press shirt and tie that suggested he understood the gravity of the situation. His mother's expression showed the stress of a parent desperately trying to protect her child from an injustice she couldn't quite understand. Principal Kenneth Ashford presided over the hearing with an air of absolute authority. At 58, he had the confident bearing of someone accustomed to deference and unquestioned control. Beside him sat Vice Principal Bennett, Dean of Students Carol Pritchard, and chemistry teacher Dr. Lawrence Patterson. "Let's begin," Ashford announced without any preliminary acknowledgement of the student or family. "Jamal Richardson, you've been accused of academic dishonesty, specifically cheating on the chemistry midterm examination administered last Tuesday. Dr. Patterson, please present the evidence." Patterson, who appeared uncomfortable with his role, explained that Jamal's exam showed similarities to another student's answers, including identical, unusual approaches to solving two complex problems. The probability of two students independently arriving at the same incorrect methodology for these problems is extremely low, Patterson concluded. Morrison noted immediately what hadn't been mentioned: whether the other student faced similar accusations, what the specific similarities were, or whether there was any evidence of how the alleged cheating occurred. Attorney Foster raised these exact questions. "Principal Ashford, who is the other student involved? Are they facing the same hearing?" Ashford's expression showed irritation at the question. "The other student's identity is confidential. They're not part of these proceedings. But surely whether that student is also being charged with cheating is relevant to establishing what actually happened." Foster pressed. "The other student cooperated with our investigation and has been dealt with appropriately," Ashford replied dismissively. "This hearing is about Jamal Richardson's conduct, not anyone else's." Morrison watched as Jamal's attorney struggled against procedural rules that seemed designed to prevent meaningful defense. Foster was a skilled civil rights lawyer, but even he had difficulty challenging a principal who controlled the information, set the rules, and served as both prosecutor and judge. "Mr. Richardson," Ashford addressed Jamal directly, "do you deny that your exam answers were improperly similar to another student's work?" Jamal responded carefully, his voice steady despite obvious stress. "Sir, I studied really hard for that exam. I can show you my study notes and explain my thinking process. If my answers are similar to someone else's, I don't know why, but I didn't cheat." "Your denials are noted," Ashford replied with a tone that made clear he'd already decided guilt. "However, the evidence is conclusive. Academic integrity is foundational to Lakewood Prep's excellence. We cannot and will not tolerate cheating." What happened next crystallized the discrimination Morrison had come to document. Diane Richardson, speaking with the controlled desperation of a mother watching her son's future being destroyed, made an observation that Ashford clearly found threatening. "Principal Ashford, Jamal has never had any disciplinary issues. He's maintained a 4.0 GPA since freshman year. He's in the running for valedictorian. Why would he risk everything by cheating on one exam? And why isn't the other student here if they have similar answers?" Her questions were logical and relevant, highlighting the implausibility of Ashford's accusation and the procedural unfairness of one-sided proceedings. Ashford's response revealed his bias with shocking clarity. "Mrs. Richardson, your son's academic record is precisely why this is so disappointing. We hold our top students to the highest standards. When they fall short, the consequences must be proportionate to our expectations." The circular logic was obvious. Jamal's success meant his alleged failure warranted harsh punishment, while presumably the cooperating student's involvement deserved leniency. But what came next exposed the racial dimension explicitly. Attorney Foster, recognizing the unfairness, pointed out that just last semester, a white student had been caught with a photographed copy of an exam and received only academic probation, not expulsion. "That case was different," Ashford snapped, his composure slipping. "That student showed remorse and came from a family deeply invested in Lakewood's mission. We consider the whole child, including their support system and likelihood of rehabilitation. Some students respond to second chances. Others—" He paused meaningfully while looking directly at Jamal. "These others demonstrate patterns of defiance and disrespect that make them incompatible with our culture of excellence." Morrison's blood ran cold. Ashford had just explicitly stated that identical misconduct warranted different consequences based on family background and subjective assessments of student culture. Vidwired language for racial discrimination. "Mr. Richardson has shown no defiance," Foster objected. "He's been completely respectful throughout this process." He questioned the validity of Dr. Patterson's analysis. Ashford countered. "He suggested our investigation was flawed. That demonstrates an attitude of disrespect toward authority that we cannot tolerate. The standard was impossible. Students were expected to accept accusations without question, and any attempt at defense was reframed as defiance, justifying even harsher punishment." Morrison watched as Ashford delivered his predetermined verdict. "Jamal Richardson, you are expelled from Lakewood Preparatory Academy, effective immediately. You have 24 hours to clear your locker and return any school property." Diane Richardson's composure broke. Jamal sat in stunned silence, and Morrison knew she had witnessed exactly the discrimination that Jackson's complaint had documented. Subjective standards applied selectively based on race, with excellence and culture weaponized, to exclude black students who didn't accept unjust authority without question. The immediate aftermath of Jamal Richardson's expulsion demonstrated the full scope of Principal Ashford's institutional power and the mechanisms that had allowed his discrimination to continue unchallenged for years. Attorney Michael Foster, requested a formal appeal to the school board, as was Jamal's procedural right under Lakewood Prep's charter. Ashford's response revealed the futility of internal accountability mechanisms. "You may file an appeal, but I should inform you that the board has never overturned one of my expulsion decisions. They trust my professional judgment about maintaining our academic standards." The statement wasn't a threat, but a fact. The board had been selected by Ashford during the school's founding and had been consistently restocked with members who shared his educational philosophy and deferred to his authority. Appealing to them for accountability was like asking Ashford to overturn himself. Diane Richardson, devastated but not defeated, turned to Angela Morrison as she and Jamal left the conference room. "You're the parent observer, right? You saw what just happened. That wasn't fair. They expelled my son based on accusations they won't even fully explain, while giving another student a pass for the same thing. Can you do anything?" Morrison, still maintaining her cover, responded with carefully calibrated sympathy. "I saw the hearing. I'll be writing a report about what I observed. But I'm just a volunteer observer. I don't have authority over discipline decisions." The response was technically true, while omitting the crucial detail that her report would have considerably more impact than a typical volunteer's. Observations. As the Richardson family left campus, Morrison remained in the administration building, observing the casual conversations among staff that revealed how normalized Ashford's discriminatory practices had become. Vice Principal Bennett congratulated Ashford on handling a difficult situation professionally. Dean Pritchard expressed relief that they'd removed a problem before it could affect our culture. And Dr. Patterson, the chemistry teacher whose accusations had triggered the expulsion, looked uncomfortable but said nothing to challenge the outcome. Miss Elena Rodriguez, an English teacher who had been walking past the conference room, approached Morrison in the hallway. She glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard before speaking quietly. "You're the parent observer, right? I need you to know that what you saw isn't unusual. Jamal is the third black honor student expelled this year. Meanwhile, we have white students who plagiarized entire essays getting warnings and academic probation. I've tried to raise concerns with administration, but teachers who question discipline decisions get unfavorable schedule assignments or lose advanced class sections. We're afraid to speak up," her whispered. Testimony confirmed that Ashford's discrimination wasn't isolated to student discipline, but extended to staff intimidation. That silenced potential objections. Morrison encouraged Rodriguez to document specific incidents, knowing that whistleblower testimony from faculty would strengthen the eventual accountability case. That afternoon, Dr. Tamara Jackson, the community organizer whose complaint had triggered Morrison's investigation, held a press conference on the steps of Lakewood Prep, demanding transparency about discipline disparities. She was joined by parents of the 7 black students expelled over the past year, all telling remarkably similar stories of subjective accusations, one-sided hearings, and harsh punishments for minor infractions. Lakewood Preparatory Academy claims to offer excellence and opportunity, Jackson told assembled reporters. But that excellence is apparently reserved for white students, while black students face a different standard where any deviation from perfect compliance results in expulsion. This isn't academic rigor, it's racial discrimination, disguised as high expectations. Her press conference drew significant media attention, with local television stations featuring the story prominently. The coverage should have prompted serious scrutiny of Ashford's practices. Instead, it triggered a defensive response that demonstrated the institutional protection he enjoyed. The Lakewood Prep Board of Directors released a statement drafted by Chairman Lawrence Patterson, father of the chemistry teacher who'd accused Jamal. Principal Ashford maintains the highest standards of academic integrity and student conduct. Discipline decisions are based solely on student behavior, not race. Suggestions otherwise are baseless. Attacks on an exemplary educator whose commitment to excellence has made Lakewood Prep a model for the nation. The statements, complete dismissal of documented disparities as baseless attacks, showed how institutional power could deflect accountability through assertions of good intentions that ignored actual outcomes. Morrison attended a community forum that evening, where Jackson presented detailed discipline data to concerned parents and residents. The statistics were damning. Black students at Lakewood were expelled at 14 times the rate of white students, suspended at 9 times the rate, and referred for behavioral interventions at 6 times the rate. Despite comprising only 12% of the student body, these aren't small differences that might reflect random variation, Jackson explained, displaying charts that made the disparities visual and undeniable. These are systematic patterns that indicate either conscious discrimination or unconscious bias that administration refuses to acknowledge or address. Several white parents in attendance became defensive, arguing that their children's success at Lakewood proved the school's merit-based approach. "My daughter works incredibly hard and follows the rules," one mother stated. "Are you saying her achievements are less valid because some students couldn't meet the same standards?" The framing revealed how easily discrimination could be rationalized, rather than questioning why standards were applied inconsistently based on race. Some parents viewed challenges to unfair discipline as attacks on their children's legitimate accomplishments. Morrison observed the community division that Ashford's discrimination had created. Some residents recognized injustice and demanded accountability. Others, invested in the school's prestige and their children's success within it, defended practices they benefited from without examining whether those benefits came at others' expense. As the forum concluded with no clear resolution beyond continued advocacy and data collection, Morrison returned to her hotel room and briefed Lieutenant Governor Thomas Reeves and Education Commissioner Dr. Patricia Nguyen on what she'd witnessed. "It's worse than the data suggested," Morrison told them. "Ashford doesn't just apply discipline disparately. He explicitly stated that students from different backgrounds deserve different consequences for the same behavior. He's using coded language about culture fit and family investment to justify discrimination. And the board enables him completely." Reeves asked the crucial question, do we have enough for immediate intervention, or do we need to observe more hearings? Morrison made her decision. We have enough. Jamal Richardson's expulsion was blatantly discriminatory, recorded in detail, and representative of a documented pattern. I'm revealing my identity tomorrow morning and taking direct action. We can't wait while more students are expelled based on race-based double standards. While Governor Morrison documented Ashford's discrimination at Lakewood Prep, her undercover operation had triggered preparations across multiple institutions that would converge on the school, with devastating consequences for the principal's career and the broader education system's complacency. About racial disparities in discipline at the governor's office in the state capital, Chief of Staff Rebecca Walsh coordinated a comprehensive response team that had been on standby throughout Morrison's undercover investigation. Walsh had spent the past week quietly assembling the personnel and resources needed for immediate intervention once Morrison gave the signal. Education Commissioner Dr. Patricia Nguyen pulled together her department's civil rights investigation team, specialists in analyzing discipline data, conducting interviews with affected students and families, and documenting systematic discrimination in educational institutions. We're not just responding to one principal's bias, Nguyen told her team. We're using this case to establish protocols for identifying and addressing discipline disparities across all state-funded schools. The preliminary data analysis her team had conducted was even more troubling than Dr. Tamara Jackson's initial complaint had indicated. Lakewood's racial disparities in discipline weren't gradual developments but had appeared suddenly 12 years ago when Ashford changed the school's discipline policies to emphasize culture of excellence and high behavioral Expectations, coded language that gave administrators wide discretion to remove students for subjective infractions. Civil rights attorney Michael Foster, who had represented Jamal Richardson at the hearing, had been quietly building a class action lawsuit on behalf of all black students expelled from Lakewood over the past 5 years. His legal team had documented 23 cases with patterns similar to Jamal's. Honor students with minimal or no prior infractions, accused of subjective violations like defiance or disrespect and expelled while white. Students with identical or worse behavior received warnings or suspensions. The legal standard for proving discrimination requires showing both disparate impact and discriminatory intent. Foster explained to his colleagues, "We have overwhelming evidence of impact through the statistics. What we've lacked is direct evidence of intent, proof that Ashford consciously treated students differently based on race." The governor's recording of the Richardson hearing gives us exactly that. Meanwhile, investigative journalist Nina Chen had been researching Lakewood Prep for a feature story about charter school accountability. Her investigation had uncovered troubling patterns beyond discipline, enrollment. Data showed that black students who applied to Lakewood were admitted at significantly lower rates than white applicants with identical academic credentials, and those who were admitted often left within the first 2 years, citing feelings of not belonging or facing excessive discipline for minor infractions. Chen had interviewed 15 former black students who had either been expelled or withdrawn from Lakewood, and their stories revealed systematic exclusion disguised as merit-based standards. "They made us feel like we didn't belong from day one," one former student told her. "Teachers watched us more closely, disciplined us more harshly, and interpreted everything we did as defiant or disrespectful. White students could make the same mistakes, and it was just kids being kids. When we did it, it was a threat to the school's culture." Her reporting would be published the morning after Morrison's planned revelation, providing external documentation that complemented the state's investigation. Back at Lakewood Prep, cafeteria worker Ms. Dorothy Green had spent 12 years watching Ashford's discriminatory practices with growing distress. As a black woman working in a support role, she was largely invisible to administrators, but perfectly positioned to observe patterns in how different students were treated. Green had kept detailed, personal notes documenting incidents she'd witnessed, black students being reprimanded for cafeteria behavior that white students engaged in without consequence, black students being reported for dress code violations, while white students wore identical clothing without comment, and black students being accused of conflicts where she'd personally witnessed white students as the primary aggressors. She'd tried reporting her observations to Vice Principal Bennett 2 years earlier and had been told that her concerns were appreciated, but not appropriate for cafeteria staff to raise. The dismissal had made clear that speaking up again would risk her employment. So she'd continued documenting in silence, hoping someone with authority would eventually investigate. When Morrison's chief of staff had quietly reached out to Lakewood employees seeking confidential interviews about discipline practices, Green had been one of the first to respond, providing years of documentation that corroborated the statistical patterns. Jamal Richardson, meanwhile, had returned home from his expulsion hearing devastated but determined not to let Ashford's injustice define his future. He spent the evening researching his options: public schools that might accept him mid-semester, private schools with scholarship programs, or online programs that would let him continue toward graduation. His mother, Diane, had posted about the expulsion on social media, and the response had been overwhelming. Dozens of families sharing similar stories of black students being pushed out of Lakewood for minor infractions, creating a public record of discrimination that individual incidents hadn't generated. "Mom, look at all these comments," Jamal said as they reviewed the flood of responses. "We're not alone. This has been happening to black students for years. Why hasn't anyone stopped it?" His question captured the central accountability failure. Individual families had complained, community organizers had documented patterns, and some teachers had raised concerns. But Ashford's institutional power and the board's protective support had insulated him from consequences. What neither Jamal nor his mother knew was that the parent observer who had witnessed his hearing was actually the governor, that his case had been selected specifically because it fit documented patterns of discrimination, and that within 24 hours his expulsion would be reversed and Ashford's career would end in the most public accountability moment in Millbrook's history. Student journalist Destiny Williams, editor of Lakewood's student newspaper, had been investigating discipline disparities for a story her faculty advisor had discouraged her from publishing. Writing about race and discipline is too controversial, the advisor had warned. It could damage the school's reputation, but Williams had continued her research independently, surveying students about their discipline experiences and documenting that black students reported feeling targeted and over-policed compared to white peers. Her unpublished article would become crucial evidence of how students themselves perceived the discriminatory environment Ashford had created. All these parallel threads, Morrison's undercover documentation, the state's prepared intervention team, Foster's class action lawsuit, Chen's investigative journalism, Green's years of witness testimony, the Richardson family's social media advocacy, and Williams's student reporting were converging on Lakewood Preparatory Academy, where Principal Ashford continued to believe his authority was protected and his discrimination would face no meaningful accountability. He had no idea that tomorrow morning the school auditorium would fill with state officials, media cameras, and community members, or that the parent observer he'd barely noticed during the Richardson hearing was about to end his career on live television. Governor Angela Morrison sat in her hotel room at 6 a.m., reviewing her legal authority and strategic approach for the intervention that would unfold in 3 hours. Lieutenant Governor Thomas Reeves and Education Commissioner Patricia Nguyen joined her for final planning, understanding that the day's events would either demonstrate decisive accountability or appear as political overreach that undermined legitimate governance. The legal foundation is solid. Attorney General Jennifer Martinez confirmed via conference call. Under State Education Code Section 48.3, you have explicit authority to investigate civil rights violations in any state-funded educational institution and to impose immediate remedial measures when violations are documented. Ashford's recording gives us clear evidence of discriminatory intent, not just disparate impact. Morrison reviewed the plan methodically. She would arrive at Lakewood Prep during the morning assembly, which Ashford convened weekly to address the entire student body and faculty. Her security detail and state officials would enter simultaneously, and she would use the assembled audience to make her revelation, public and dramatic, ensuring that accountability happened transparently, rather than through backroom negotiations that might be perceived as politically motivated. The risk is that it looks performative, Reeves cautioned. Critics will say you're using students as props for political theater rather than handling this through proper administrative channels. Morrison had considered this criticism carefully. The proper channels have failed for 12 years. Dr. Jackson filed complaints with the school board that were dismissed. Parents filed grievances that went nowhere. Teachers raised concerns and were intimidated into silence. When institutions protect discrimination, transparency becomes the accountability mechanism. I want every student at Lakewood to see that authority figures face consequences for violating civil rights. And I want every administrator in this state to understand that gubernatorial oversight is real. At 8:30 a.m., Morrison entered Lakewood Preparatory Academy through the main entrance, this time wearing her typical professional attire and accompanied by state officials carrying the governor's seal. The receptionist, who had barely acknowledged Angela Morrison the previous day, looked up in confusion as Morrison strode past without checking in, flanked by security and trailed by the media pool that accompanied official gubernatorial events. Principal Ashford was on stage in the auditorium, delivering his weekly address about maintaining Lakewood's culture of excellence, when Morrison's chief of staff approached from the side entrance and whispered that the governor had arrived and needed to address the assembly. Immediately, Ashford's expression showed irritation at the interruption. He was accustomed to controlling his domain completely and viewed unexpected official visits as disruptions to his authority. "Can this wait until after assembly? We're in the middle of an important address to students." "No, it cannot wait," Chief of Staff Walsh replied firmly. "The governor is invoking her statutory authority to address civil rights violations. You can yield the stage voluntarily or be removed from it, but she will be speaking now." The ultimatum left no room for negotiation. Ashford, visibly angry but uncertain how to resist an explicit gubernatorial order, stepped aside as Morrison took the stage. The auditorium held 800 students and 60 faculty members, all now focused on the unexpected presence of the state's highest elected official at their school assembly. Morrison had deliberately chosen this moment for maximum impact, transparency, and public accountability, rather than private administrative action. "Good morning," Morrison began, her voice carrying natural authority throughout the space. "I'm Governor Angela Morrison. Most of you don't know me, but some of you saw me yesterday sitting in the back of a disciplinary hearing as a parent volunteer observer." She paused, letting recognition dawn on those who had been present at Jamal Richardson's expulsion hearing: Ashford, Vice Principal Bennett, Dean Pritchard, and the few students and staff who had been in the conference room or hallway. "I wasn't just a parent observer," Morrison continued. "I've spent the past week investigating allegations of systematic racial discrimination in discipline at this school. Yesterday, I personally witnessed Principal Ashford expel an honor student with a 4.0 GPA based on questionable cheating accusations, while explicitly stating that students from different family backgrounds deserve different consequences for the same behavior." The auditorium erupted in surprised murmurs. Students exchanged glances. Faculty members looked between Morrison and Ashford, with expressions ranging from shock to validation to concern. Ashford attempted to interject from his position at the side of the stage. "Governor Morrison, this is highly irregular. Discipline decisions are administrative matters that should be addressed through proper channels, not public. Proper channels that you control completely." Morrison interrupted, her tone sharp. "Channels where the board you appointed rubber stamps your decisions. Channels where teachers who raise concerns face retaliation. Those proper channels have protected discrimination for 12 years while black students were expelled at 14 times the rate of white students." She displayed data on the auditorium's large screens, charts, showing Lakewood's discipline disparities compared to other district schools, gave summaries of expelled black students, and finally, excerpts from her recording of Jamal's hearing, where Ashford's own words demonstrated discriminatory reasoning. The evidence was undeniable and devastating, presented to an audience of students and staff who had experienced or witnessed Ashford's practices, but lacked the authority to challenge them. Education. Commissioner Nguyen stepped forward to read formal findings. "The State Education Department's investigation has documented systematic violations of civil rights protections in discipline practices at Lakewood Preparatory Academy. Principal Kenneth Ashford applied subjective standards inconsistently based on race, expelled black students for infractions that warranted warnings for white students, and created a hostile educational environment that denied equal access to educational opportunities." Vice Principal Bennett, realizing his complicity would face scrutiny, attempted to distance himself. "Governor, I implemented Principal Ashford's discipline policies, but I wasn't aware they were being applied discriminatorily. I trusted his professional judgment. Morrison turned to him with an expression of contempt. "Mr. Bennett, you sat in that hearing yesterday. You heard Principal Ashford explicitly state that family background should determine consequences. Your claim of ignorance isn't credible. It's complicity disguised as deference to authority. The direct accusation made clear that accountability wouldn't stop with Ashford, but would extend to administrators who had enabled his discrimination through active support or passive acceptance." Attorney Michael Foster stepped onto the stage with formal legal notification. "Principal Ashford, I'm serving you with notice of a federal civil rights lawsuit filed on behalf of 23 students who were expelled from Lakewood Preparatory Academy based on discriminatory discipline practices. The complaint seeks compensatory damages, expungement of discipline records, and injunctive relief, requiring comprehensive reforms. The lawsuit added legal consequences to administrative accountability, ensuring that even if Ashford somehow retained his position, he would face personal liability for the discrimination Morrison had documented. Her public testimony, delivered in front of her colleagues and employer, demonstrated extraordinary courage and validated Morrison's decision to make the accountability moment transparent rather than private. Other faculty members began standing, creating a visual representation of institutional complicity and emerging accountability. Mr. Kevin Park, the history teacher who had remained silent during previous incidents, spoke next. "I witnessed a black student get suspended for being late to class 3 times in a semester. That same semester, a white student was late 12 times and received only a verbal warning. When I questioned the disparity, I was told that context matters and that some students need different approaches. I should have pushed harder. I should have documented it and reported it formally." His admission of passive complicity rather than active participation helped other staff members recognize that silence in the face of injustice carried its own accountability. Student council member Destiny Williams stood from the student section, her voice clear and steady. "I'm the editor of the school newspaper. I wrote an investigative article 6 months ago documenting discipline disparities based on race. My faculty advisor told me it was too controversial to publish and would damage the school's reputation. But the truth doesn't damage reputation. Discrimination does. I have surveys from 150 students showing that black students feel targeted and over-policed compared to white students. I was silenced because the truth was inconvenient." Her testimony demonstrated that even students recognized the discrimination that administrators had denied and concealed. Ashford attempted one final defense, his voice taking on a tone of wounded dignity. "Governor, I've dedicated 20 years to building Lakewood into an exceptional school. Our test scores, college admissions, and academic achievements speak for themselves. If discipline rates differ by demographic, that reflects different behavioral choices by students, not discrimination by administration. We hold all students to the same high standards. Some meet them, and unfortunately some don't." The argument was a classic defense of discriminatory systems, claiming neutral standards while ignoring that those standards were applied subjectively and inconsistently based on race. Morrison's response dismantled the defense systematically. "Principal Ashford, you don't hold students to the same standards. That's precisely the problem. Yesterday, you expelled Jamal Richardson, a 4.0 student with 0 prior infractions, for allegedly cheating on an exam. You provided no concrete evidence, didn't allow him to meaningfully defend himself, and refused to identify whether the other student involved faced similar consequences. Then you explicitly stated that students from different family backgrounds deserve different treatment for the same behavior." She played the audio recording of Ashford's own words from the hearing. "We consider the whole child, including their support system and likelihood of rehabilitation. Some students respond to second chances. Others demonstrate patterns of defiance and disrespect that make them incompatible with our culture of excellence." Hearing his own coded language played back in the auditorium made the discrimination undeniable. Students and faculty who might have rationalized individual incidents, who couldn't rationalize Ashford's own recorded admission, that he applied different standards based on his subjective assessment of students' backgrounds. That audio, Morrison continued, combined with data showing black students expelled at 14 times the rate of white students, constitute clear evidence of intentional discrimination, not just unfortunate disparities. You created a system where subjective infractions like defiance and disrespect gave you unlimited discretion to remove students. You deemed incompatible with Lakewood's culture, and that discretion was exercised almost exclusively against black students. Vice Principal Stuart Bennett, realizing his own complicity was being documented publicly, made a desperate attempt to shift blame entirely to Ashford. Governor Morrison, I implemented policies that Principal Ashford established. If those policies were discriminatory, I wasn't aware of the intent behind them. I was following directives from my superior. Morrison turned to him with withering contempt. Mr. Bennett, following orders has never been an acceptable defense for participating in discrimination. You sat in disciplinary hearings. You signed off on expulsion paperwork. You corroborated Ashford's decisions in official reports. You weren't a passive bystander. You were an active participant who enabled discrimination by lending it the appearance of administrative consensus. Cafeteria worker Dorothy Green, emboldened by the revelations unfolding on stage, stood from the staff section where support personnel typically sat silently. I've worked here 12 years. I see everything because nobody pays attention to cafeteria workers. I've watched black students get written up for cafeteria behavior that white students do every single day without consequence. I documented it in personal notes for years because when I tried to report it, I was told it wasn't my place to comment on discipline. I have 200 pages of specific incidents with dates, times, and student names if the state wants them. Her offer of detailed corroborating evidence demonstrated that discrimination had been visible to anyone paying attention, but institutional power structures had prevented those observations from triggering accountability. Education Commissioner Nguyen stepped forward with formal administrative action. Principal Kenneth Ashford, effective immediately. You are suspended without pay, pending a full investigation into civil rights violations. Vice Principal Stuart Bennett, you are also suspended pending investigation of your role in implementing and enabling discriminatory discipline practices. The State Education Department is assuming temporary administrative authority over Lakewood Preparatory Academy until reforms are implemented and new leadership is appointed. The swift action sent shockwaves through the auditorium. The administrators who had wielded absolute authority minutes earlier were now removed from their positions. Their careers effectively ended regardless of the investigation's eventual formal conclusions. Ashford's face showed a mixture of shock, humiliation, and fury. This is a witch hunt. You're destroying my career and this school's reputation based on statistical coincidences and out-of-context comments. The board will fight this. Our parents will fight this. Morrison addressed his threat calmly. The board can fight if they choose. Parents can object if they prefer discrimination that benefits their children. But the state's authority to enforce civil rights protections in publicly funded institutions is absolute and non-negotiable. Lakewood receives $8 million annually in state funding. That funding requires constitutional compliance. You systematically violated that requirement for 12 years. Now you face consequences. She turned back to the assembled students. Some of you are wondering what this means for Lakewood's future. Let me be clear, this school will continue operating. Your education won't be interrupted. But the culture that made some students feel welcome while making others feel targeted will change fundamentally. Excellence and equity aren't contradictory. They're inseparable. A school that achieves high outcomes by excluding students who don't fit narrow cultural expectations isn't excellent. It's discriminatory, Jamal Richardson, who had been watching from the audience with his mother, stood with tears streaming down his face. Morrison acknowledged him directly. "Mr. Richardson, your expulsion is rescinded, effective immediately. You will return to classes with full restoration of your academic standing. Additionally, the state will review every expulsion. Principal Ashford ordered in the past 5 years to identify other students who were discriminatorily removed and deserve reinstatement. The personal acknowledgement and concrete remediation demonstrated that accountability meant more than punishing perpetrators. It meant restoring victims and preventing future harm. As state officials escorted Ashford and Bennett from the auditorium, the former principal made one final statement to assembled media cameras. "This is political persecution of an educator who maintained high standards. History will vindicate me." Morrison's response was definitive. "History will record that you discriminated against children entrusted to your care, that you used your authority to exclude rather than educate, and that when held accountable, you claimed victimhood rather than acknowledging the real victims of your actions. That's the legacy you've created." The day following Principal Ashford's public removal, Governor Morrison convened an emergency meeting with the Lakewood Preparatory Academy Board of Directors, making clear that their complicity in enabling years of discrimination would face scrutiny equal to Ashford's active misconduct. Board Chairman Lawrence Patterson, whose son taught chemistry at Lakewood and had accused Jamal Richardson of cheating, opened the meeting with defensive posturing. "Governor, while we appreciate your concern for civil rights, the board believes this intervention represents governmental overreach. Principal Ashford built Lakewood into an exemplary institution, and his removal based on statistical analysis and isolated incidents threatens to undermine everything we've achieved." Morrison's response was immediate and uncompromising. "Mr. Patterson, your board received 3 formal complaints about racial disparities in discipline over the past 4 years. You dismissed each one without meaningful investigation. Dr. Tamara Jackson presented you with comprehensive data 18 months ago showing that black students were expelled at rates 14 times higher than white students. Your response was a letter stating that discipline decisions reflect individual student choices, not systemic bias. That wasn't oversight. That was willful blindness that enabled discrimination to continue unchecked." She displayed the board's own meeting minutes on the conference room screen, showing repeated discussions of Lakewood's culture of excellence and maintaining standards without any documented examination of whether those standards were applied equitably across all student demographics. Board member Susan Chen, one of 3 members who had privately expressed concerns about discipline patterns but had been outvoted by the majority, spoke up. "Governor Morrison, some of us did raise questions about the discipline data, but we were told by Chairman Patterson and Principal Ashford that any public discussion of racial disparities would damage the school's reputation and discourage enrollment. We were assured that individual case reviews showed legitimate behavioral issues, not discrimination." Her testimony revealed the internal dynamics that had protected Ashford, a majority coalition committed to defending the school's reputation at any cost, silencing the minority who recognized problems. Morrison addressed the full board with a stark choice. "Every member of this board has a decision to make. You can acknowledge that you failed in your oversight responsibilities, commit to comprehensive reform, and work with the state to rebuild Lakewood's culture. Or you can continue defending indefensible practices, in which case I will exercise my statutory authority to dissolve this board entirely and appoint a state-managed interim governance structure. You have 24 hours to decide." The ultimatum was designed to separate board members willing to embrace accountability from those committed to institutional self-protection, regardless of civil rights violations. That afternoon, Morrison held a community forum at Westside Community Center, inviting all families who had been affected by Lakewood's discriminatory discipline. Over 200 people attended, parents of expelled students, current students who had experienced differential treatment, and community members who had witnessed the patterns for years. Marcus Henderson, father of Aliyah Brooks, who had been expelled the previous year for repeated defiance, spoke first. "My daughter was an honor roll student, debate team captain, and had been accepted to 3 universities when Lakewood expelled her 2 months before graduation. Her defiance was questioning why she received detention for being 2 minutes late to class, when white students were routinely 5 or 10 minutes late without consequence. She lost her scholarships because she didn't graduate from Lakewood. That's not high standards. That's destroying a child's future for challenging discrimination." His testimony personalized the abstract concept of educational harm, making clear that Ashford's discipline decisions had concrete, devastating impacts on students' lives and futures. Dr. Tamara Jackson presented updated research showing that Lakewood's discrimination extended beyond discipline into academic tracking. Black students at Lakewood were placed in advanced courses at half the rate of white students with identical test scores and grades. When black families advocated for appropriate placement, they were told their children weren't ready for the rigor or needed to prove themselves in regular courses first. White students with lower qualifications were placed in advanced courses based on teacher recommendations and parental advocacy. The discrimination wasn't just in who got expelled, it was in who got access to the education that Lakewood claimed to provide equally. Her expanded analysis revealed that the problems ran deeper than discipline, permeating every aspect of how black students experienced the school. Former student Isaiah Carter, who had withdrawn from Lakewood after experiencing constant surveillance and discipline threats, testified about the daily reality of discrimination. "Every morning, I walked into school feeling like I was being watched for mistakes. Teachers monitored me more closely than white students. I got dress-coded for clothes that white students wore without comment. I was accused of plagiarism on an essay that was entirely my own work, and had to prove my innocence, while white students' work was trusted without question. Eventually I left because the constant stress wasn't worth it. Even though Lakewood's college placement record was better than my new schools, his account demonstrated how discrimination operated through accumulation of daily indignities that made black students' educational experiences fundamentally different from and worse than white students' experiences in the same institution. Education Commissioner Patricia Guyon announced immediate remedial measures, effective tomorrow. Every student expelled from Lakewood Preparatory Academy in the past 5 years will have their cases reviewed by an independent panel. Students whose expulsions are determined to have been discriminatory will have their records expunged, receive formal apologies, and be offered reinstatement or compensation for educational disruption. Additionally, we're implementing mandatory implicit bias training for all Lakewood staff, revised discipline policies that eliminate subjective infractions like defiance, and a civilian oversight committee with authority to review discipline decisions. The comprehensive response demonstrated state commitment to both remediation for past victims and prevention of future discrimination. Attorney Michael Foster provided an update on the federal civil rights lawsuit. We now have 37 plaintiffs, families of expelled students, families of students who were discriminatorily tracked into lower academic courses, and current students who have experienced hostile educational environment. We're seeking both compensatory damages for individual harm and injunctive relief requiring systematic reforms. The governor's intervention supports our case but doesn't replace it. We want both administrative accountability through the state and legal accountability through the courts. His dual-track approach ensured that even if state reforms proved insufficient, federal court oversight would mandate continued compliance. Morrison concluded the forum with a commitment that extended beyond Lakewood. What happened at this school is unacceptable, but it's not unique. We're conducting audits of discipline data at every charter school in this state and implementing early warning systems to flag disparities before they become entrenched patterns. When publicly funded schools show significant discipline disparities by race, they will be required to explain those disparities or face state intervention. The burden of proof is shifting. Schools must affirmatively demonstrate equitable treatment, not just deny discrimination when it's documented. The statewide expansion of accountability mechanisms signaled that Lakewood's exposure would catalyze broader reform rather than being treated as an isolated incident. As the forum concluded, Morrison met privately with Jamal Richardson and his mother Diane. "How are you doing?" Morrison asked the young man whose false expulsion had been the catalyst for public accountability. "I'm okay," Jamal replied. "I'm back in classes, and actually some teachers have apologized for not speaking up earlier. But it's weird being there knowing what happened. Some students blame me for getting Ashford fired, like I did something wrong by being expelled unfairly." His experience highlighted the complexity of being a victim whose experience triggered institutional accountability, gratitude mixed with resentment, vindication mixed with continued stigma. Morrison addressed his concern directly. "Jamal, you didn't get anyone fired. Principal Ashford's discrimination got him fired. Your only role was being victimized and having the courage not to accept that victimization as deserved. The students who blame you are protecting their comfort with a system that benefited them, rather than confronting the injustice that system inflicted on you. That's not your burden to carry." Her validation helped reframe Jamal's experience from guilt about consequences to justified accountability for genuine wrongdoing. Over the following 3 weeks, Lakewood Preparatory Academy underwent a transformation as comprehensive as it was uncomfortable for those invested in defending the previous culture. Interim Principal Dr. Sharon Hayes, a nationally recognized expert in equitable education with a track record of leading diverse schools to excellence, accepted Governor Morrison's appointment to lead the institutional reformation. Dr. Hayes's first action was mandatory listening sessions, where every expelled student from the past 5 years could share their experiences with faculty, current students, and community members. The sessions were painful but necessary, forcing those who had benefited from or been complicit in discrimination to confront its human cost. Marcus Williams, expelled 3 years earlier for aggressive behavior after asking why he received detention for talking in the hallway while white students engaged in the same behavior without consequence, addressed a packed auditorium. "I was 14 years old when Lakewood expelled me. I wasn't aggressive. I was confused and frustrated that I was being punished for something other students did freely. But questioning authority as a black student was treated as threatening rather than legitimate advocacy. I spent 3 years at an under-resourced school, lost opportunities for advanced coursework, and watched my college prospects narrow because one administrator decided I didn't fit his vision of excellence." His testimony was one of 37 similar accounts, creating an undeniable record of systematic harm that statistics alone couldn't fully capture. The independent review panel that Commissioner Nguyen had established found that 29 of the 37 expulsions reviewed showed clear evidence of discriminatory intent or disparate treatment that violated civil rights protections. Each student received formal written apologies from the state, expungement of their discipline records, and offers of educational remediation, including tutoring, test preparation, and application support for college admissions. Chemistry teacher Dr. Lawrence Patterson, whose accusation of cheating had triggered Jamal Richardson's expulsion, resigned from Lakewood rather than participate in the mandatory bias training and oversight that Dr. Hayes implemented. His departure was voluntary but effectively forced, as the reformed culture made his presence untenable. "I've taught at Lakewood for 12 years and maintained rigorous academic standards," Patterson stated in his resignation letter. The current climate of constant scrutiny and assumption that legitimate discipline is discriminatory makes it impossible to maintain excellence. I'm seeking a position where academic integrity is still valued. His framing revealed the fundamental misunderstanding that many defenders of the old system held, that equity and excellence were contradictory rather than complementary, and that being held accountable for discriminatory practices represented persecution rather than appropriate oversight. Ms. Elena Rodriguez, promoted to Dean of Students in the Reformed administration, implemented a revolutionary discipline system that eliminated subjective infractions entirely. The new code specified concrete behaviors that warranted discipline: physical violence, property destruction, academic dishonesty with clear evidence, and required documentation from multiple sources before any suspension or expulsion could be considered. We're removing administrator discretion for subjective infractions like defiance or disrespect, and Rodriguez explained to faculty during training. Those terms gave unlimited authority to remove students administrators didn't like while claiming legitimate behavioral standards. If a student's behavior is genuinely disruptive, we can document specific actions. If we can't document specifics, then the problem isn't the student's behavior, it's our subjective discomfort with that student. The policy shift fundamentally changed power dynamics, protecting students from arbitrary discipline while maintaining legitimate behavioral expectations. Student journalist Destiny Williams finally published her investigative article about discipline disparities, this time with full support from her new faculty advisor and Dr. Hayes' administration. The article won a state high school journalism award and was cited in Education Week's coverage of Lakewood's transformation as an example of student voice, contributing to institutional accountability. Cafeteria worker Dorothy Green, whose 12 years of documentation had provided crucial corroborating evidence, was invited to join the new Civilian Oversight Committee that reviewed all discipline decisions. Her inclusion demonstrated that institutional reform required elevating voices that had been marginalized and dismissed under the previous power structure. For 12 years I watched and took notes but felt powerless to change anything, Green told a reporter covering Lakewood's transformation. Now I'm helping ensure that what I witnessed never happens again. That's what accountability looks like, not just punishing wrongdoers, but empowering those who witnessed wrong to prevent its recurrence. The Lakewood Board of Directors faced its own reckoning. Chairman Lawrence Patterson and 3 other members resigned rather than accept state-mandated oversight and reform requirements. The remaining 5 members, including Susan Chen, who had tried to raise concerns previously, worked with Governor Morrison's office to recruit new board members with expertise in equitable education and civil rights compliance. The reconstituted board adopted new bylaws requiring annual civil rights audits, demographic analysis of all discipline decisions, and immediate investigation of any disparity exceeding a 2.1 ratio between any 2 demographic groups. The specific numerical threshold removed subjectivity from when investigations were triggered, preventing future boards from dismissing obvious patterns as coincidental. District Attorney Michael Zhang's office filed criminal civil rights charges against former Principal Ashford for willful deprivation of educational rights under color of authority. The charges were unprecedented: criminal prosecution of a school administrator for discriminatory discipline, but Zhang argued they were justified by the systematic and intentional nature of Ashford's conduct when a public official uses their authority to systematically deprive people of constitutional rights. That's not just an administrative failure or civil rights violation, it's criminal conduct that deserves criminal accountability. Zhang explained at a press conference announcing the charges. The prosecution sent a powerful message that educational discrimination carried consequences. Beyond job loss and civil liability, perpetrators faced potential incarceration for egregious violations. Vice Principal Stuart Bennett, facing similar charges, negotiated a plea agreement where he accepted responsibility for enabling Ashford's discrimination, cooperated fully with ongoing investigations, and agreed to never work in educational administration again. His cooperation provided additional evidence about how the discriminatory culture had been institutionalized through official policies and unofficial practices. Investigative journalist Nina Chen published her comprehensive feature story, How One Elite School Built Success on Systematic Exclusion and How It Was Finally Held Accountable. The article documented not just Lakewood's specific failures, but broader patterns in charter schools nationwide where culture of excellence rhetoric masked discriminatory selection and discipline practices. Her reporting sparked similar investigations in 3 other states, demonstrating how one institution's accountability moment could catalyze broader reform when journalists connected local incidents to systemic patterns. Academic researchers from Morrison's alma mater, Yale, requested permission to study Lakewood's transformation as a case study in institutional reform following exposure of discrimination. Dr. Hayes approved, understanding that documentation of both the problems and the solutions could inform policy nationwide. The research team's preliminary findings confirmed what Morrison had suspected. Lakewood's discrimination hadn't been primarily about individual racist administrators, but about systemic structures that gave those administrators unlimited subjective authority without meaningful oversight, creating conditions where implicit and explicit bias could flourish unchecked. Reform requires changing both personnel and systems, the lead researcher explained. Removing Ashford was necessary but insufficient. The board structure that protected him, the discipline policies that gave him unlimited discretion, and the culture that valued reputation over equity all needed systematic transformation. 6 months after Governor Angela Morrison's dramatic revelation at Lakewood Preparatory Academy, she returned to the school for an official assessment of whether the reforms had produced genuine cultural change or merely temporary compliance that would fade once state attention diminished. She arrived during lunch period, walking through the cafeteria where Dorothy Green now worked with visible pride, rather than the quiet resignation that had characterized her previous 12 years. Students of all backgrounds sat together without the self-segregation that had been common under Ashford's administration, and the atmosphere felt genuinely inclusive rather than superficially diverse. Governor Morrison, Jamal Richardson called out, approaching with several classmates. "We were hoping you'd visit. Want to see what's actually changed?" His comfort approaching the governor demonstrated the cultural shift Dr. Hayes had cultivated. Students felt empowered rather than monitored, welcomed rather than tolerated. Jamal led Morrison on a tour highlighting concrete changes. The discipline office that had been Principal Ashford's domain now displayed data publicly showing discipline rates by demographic category, updated monthly, with any disparity exceeding 2.1 automatically triggering review. The current data showed black and white students receiving discipline at nearly identical rates, 1.2.1, well within the margin that could reflect random variation rather than systemic bias. Dr. Hayes requires every discipline referral to specify concrete, observable behaviors, Jamal explained. Teachers can't just say a student was defiant anymore. They have to document exactly what the student did, and administrators review whether white students doing the same thing receive equivalent consequences. It's made teachers think twice before making referrals based on vague feelings that a student was disrespectful. The systematic approach to eliminating subjective bias had transformed daily operations, making discrimination organizationally difficult to sustain rather than relying on individual goodwill. Student Council now included a civil rights committee that Destiny Williams chaired, giving students formal authority to review discipline patterns and advocate for peers who felt they'd been treated unfairly. The committee had successfully challenged 3 discipline decisions, where students demonstrated that white peers had engaged in identical behavior without consequence. "We're not just complaining about problems anymore," Williams told Morrison. "We have actual power to demand accountability and fix issues before they become patterns." That's what changes culture, giving students agency rather than just asking them to trust that adults will be fair. Ms. Elena Rodriguez, now Dean of Students, reported that discipline referrals overall had decreased by 40% since the reforms were implemented, contradicting predictions that reducing administrator discretion would lead to chaos. When discipline is fair and consistently applied, students actually behave better because they understand expectations and trust the system. Under Ashford, students never knew what would trigger harsh punishment, so there was constant anxiety and resentment. Now students know the rules and the consequences, and they adjust accordingly. The data validated what equity advocates had long argued. Fair systems produced better outcomes for everyone, not just protected minorities from discrimination. The independent review panel had ultimately reinstated or compensated 31 of 37 expelled students whose cases showed discriminatory treatment. 23 students chose to return to Lakewood with their records expunged, while 8 preferred to remain at their current schools and accepted financial compensation for educational disruption. Marcus Williams, expelled 3 years earlier for questioning discriminatory discipline, had returned to Lakewood for his senior year and was now applying to universities with the competitive GPA and advanced coursework that his earlier expulsion had denied him. "I lost 3 years, but at least my future isn't destroyed anymore," he told Morrison. "And knowing that what happened to me led to changes that will protect others. Students makes it feel less meaningless." His conditional satisfaction highlighted the complexity of remediation. Justice delayed was still justice denied. But accountability was better than continued impunity. Former Principal Kenneth Ashford had been convicted on federal civil rights charges and sentenced to 2 years in prison plus 3 years probation, a sentence that shocked many in education circles who had never seen criminal prosecution of discriminatory discipline. The conviction established legal precedent that systematic discrimination in educational settings could trigger criminal rather than just civil or administrative liability. Vice Principal Stewart Bennett's cooperation with prosecutors had led to additional revelations about how Lakewood's discrimination extended beyond discipline into academic tracking, college counseling access, and extracurricular opportunities, all areas where black students received measurably inferior treatment compared to white peers. The comprehensive nature of the discrimination made clear. This hadn't been one administrator's isolated bias, but institutional culture that required systematic rather than superficial reform. Dr. Sharon Hayes' leadership had been so successful that the Lakewood Board asked her to remain as permanent principal rather than interim administrator. She accepted on the condition that her contract explicitly required maintaining the equity reforms and prohibited any rollback of oversight mechanisms. Accountability can't depend on having the right person in charge, Hayes explained to the board. It requires systems that make discrimination difficult and transparency that makes it detectable when it occurs. "I'll lead this school, but only if we institutionalize equity rather than personalizing it." Her insistence on systematic rather than individual solutions demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how organizational change becomes sustainable. Governor Morrison's statewide charter school audit had identified 4 other schools with discipline disparities suggesting potential discrimination. Each received immediate state oversight and mandatory reforms, sending a clear message that Lakewood's accountability wasn't exceptional, but represented standard enforcement of civil rights protections. On Morrison's final evening reviewing Lakewood's transformation, she met privately with Dr. Tamara Jackson, whose persistent advocacy had triggered the investigation that exposed Ashford's discrimination. "You changed everything," Morrison told her. "Most people accept injustice because challenging institutions seems futile. You refused to accept that my nephew's expulsion was just bad luck or inevitable. Your documentation made accountability possible." Jackson smiled, but remained realistic. "The reforms are impressive, but I'm watching to see if they last beyond your governorship and Dr. Hayes's leadership. Real change means the next generation of administrators maintains equity even without external pressure." Her skepticism was warranted. History showed that civil rights gains often eroded when sustained pressure diminished. Morrison acknowledged the concern directly. "That's why we built transparency and oversight into policy rather than relying on goodwill," Morrison replied. "The Civilian Review Committee has subpoena power. The automatic investigation triggers for demographic disparities can't be waived by future boards. And parents like you know what accountability looks like now. You won't accept less." As Morrison prepared to leave Lakewood's campus, Jamal Richardson approached one final time. "Governor, I wanted to thank you personally. What you did, going undercover, risking political backlash, making the accountability public, that saved my future. I'm applying to Yale because you showed me that standing up to injustice matters." His gratitude was genuine, but Morrison reframed the narrative. "Jamal, I documented what was happening to you, but you're the one who maintained your integrity when accused falsely, refused to accept guilt for something you didn't do, and trusted that truth would eventually matter. That courage is what made accountability possible. Don't credit me for your own strength. The exchange captured the essential truth about systematic reform. It required both individuals with courage to challenge injustice and institutions, willing to hold perpetrators accountable when that injustice was exposed." Lakewood Preparatory Academy's transformation from a discriminatory institution, hiding behind claims of excellence, to a genuinely equitable school serving all students, demonstrated that accountability could catalyze meaningful change. But it also showed how much effort that change required. Not just removing one bad principle, but restructuring board governance, revising policies, retraining staff, empowering students, implementing oversight mechanisms, and prosecuting criminal violations. The easy path would have been accepting Ashford's statistical success without examining how that success was built on excluding students he deemed unworthy. Morrison's decision to investigate, document, and publicly expose the discrimination had been politically risky and operationally complex. But for 37 students whose educational futures had been stolen by discriminatory expulsions, for hundreds of current students who now attended school without fear of arbitrary punishment, and for future generations who would benefit from the reforms and oversight that Lakewood's accountability had established, the difficult path had been the necessary one. As Morrison drove away from campus, she reflected that this was what executive authority was meant for. Not symbolic gestures or political theater, but using power to protect those whom institutional structures had failed. One school's transformation wouldn't solve educational inequities statewide, but it established that discrimination would face real consequences, and that claims of excellence wouldn't protect institutions that violated civil rights. And sometimes that accountability, public, immediate, and comprehensive, was exactly what justice required. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.